Welcome to Precalculus Concept 24b. We're going to recognize the domain and the range of sine and cosine. There's only 3 boxes here. So let's begin by having a conversation about the domain and range for the sine function. In the last video, we learned that the sine of angle theta is always related to the y-coordinate on the unit circle. So sine theta is equal to y. So I want you to consider for a moment drawing a bunch of sort of little triangles inside the unit circle and taking a look at the y values, because the sine value, the sine of theta, is equal to y. So for a moment, right, if we look at all the y values, well, we can see that I can draw lines, or I can draw triangles that anywhere on this unit circle, like kind of like this one. If I drew a right triangle here, then the y value would be whatever that point is. Okay. If I were to draw a triangle here, and then the y coordinate would be whatever, the y value would be whatever that value is. If I drew a triangle over here in quadrant 4, a right triangle, and I looked back, I could see that I would get whatever y value is there, and the same thing here. So the whole point that I'm trying to make here is that all of the outputs, all of the y values for us, the domain, right, and the range, it can be calculated from looking at this circle here, right? So let's talk first about the domain. All right. So when we're talking about domain for trig functions, we're talking about all of the inputs, and the inputs are angles here. And so the question you have to ask yourself is there any angle for which I could not get a y value out? And the answer in this case is no. There is no angle for which you can get that you won't be able to get a y value out. So the domain for the sine function is going to be all real numbers. And when I'm talking about real numbers, I'm talking about the angles for which we put in. So I can take the sine of any angle that you can think of. Right? That's why the domain is all real numbers. The range, however, goes back to what I was just talking about, the y coordinates here, the output values here. The range is between -1 and 1. So how do I know that? Because if I take a look at this, the smallest y value I see on the unit circle is -1, and the biggest y value I see on the unit circle is +1. So the range of the sine function is trapped between -1 and 1, but the domain is all real numbers. By the way, it is to note that you can have -1 and 1, so those are members of the range. Otherwise, my answer would have looked like this with the brackets, or I mean with the parentheses, but that's not correct. Okay, they can be 1 or -1, so it's a special note. They take a look at that. So again, domain is all real numbers for sine function, and the range is trapped between -1 and 1. The story is very, very similar for the cosine of an angle, finding the domain and the range. So take a look at this picture I have over here. You can see that what I'm going to be talking about here is the x values here, because I'm looking for the outputs for that. But before we get into that, let's talk about the domain. Okay, and again, when we're talking about domain for trig functions, we're talking about the theta. So is there any angle for which I could not get an x value out? And similarly, the answer is no. So the domain for cosine function is any real angle that you can think of, you're allowed to put in there. The range, right? The range are going to be the outputs. And since the cosine function deals only with the x's, if I take a look at only the x values here, you can see that no matter what triangle I drew, right, the x coordinate would have a place somewhere trapped between -1 and 1. So again, the range is trapped between -1 and 1, just like it was for the sine function, but the domain is all real numbers. Okay, so the domain for cosine is all real angle you can think of, and the range is trapped between -1 and 1, including -1 and 1. Okay, so here's your U-try. Not a trick question, just kind of asking you to think about this. So what are the domains and the range for sine theta and cosine theta?